The new decade has been an interesting time for pop music, full of disappointing album sales, even from some of the biggest artists of all time. In this video, we'll look at 10 of the biggest flop albums of the 2020s so far. The End of an Era by Iggy Azalea. Iggy Azalea once ruled the charts with hits like Fancy and Black Widow when she broke through back in 2014, but by the time The End of an Era dropped in August 2021, the buzz around her name had all but faded. Despite the album's title suggesting a grand farewell, it was barely noticed. It sold just 5,000 copies in its first week, debuting on number 52 on the Billboard 200, a massive drop compared to her debut album The New Classic, which hit number 3. The album received little to no radio play, with singles like Brazil and I Am the Strip Club failing to chart on the Hot 100. Even streaming numbers were underwhelming. No song on the album is yet to cross the 30 million Spotify stream mark. The rollout was disappointing. To make matters worse, Iggy announced this would be her last album, but the lack of fanfare made her supposed final chapter feel like an afterthought. With no label backing and minimal promo, The End of an Era lived up to its name, but not the way she wanted. Treat Myself by Meghan Trainor. Meghan Trainor's Treat Myself was meant to be her grand return to pop music. The album had a long, rocky road to release. Initially announced in 2018 and delayed multiple times, it finally dropped in January 2020. It had a disjointed rollout and multiple underwhelming singles. No Excuses, Wave, and Nice to Meet Ya featuring Nicki Minaj failed to make waves, with none of them cracking the Billboard Hot 100's top 40. Commercially, the album opened with just 23,000 units sold in its first week, debuting on number 25 on the Billboard 200, a far cry from the number 1 debut of her 2015 album title. In fact, it was her lowest opening week at the time. The pivot from her usual sound to chasing trends didn't really work. The delays and last-minute changes created a bloated track list that struggled to hold attention. The timing of it being released just before the pandemic shut everything down made sure that the album didn't get a chance to build up steam, and it became one of the biggest flops of the year. Honestly Nevermind by Drake. Drake has one of the best-selling discographies ever, so when he surprise released Honestly Nevermind in June 2022, just 9 months after Certified Lover Boy, expectations were high. But the album had a bold shift in sound, leaning into house, dance, and Baltimore club influences. It was a big departure from his usual rap and R&B fusion. While critics liked the experimentation, many fans were confused. The album was labeled vibes only, with minimal lyrical depth, and social media reactions ranged from boredom to hate. Despite debuting at number 1 on the Billboard 200, with 204,000 units sold, the album had one of Drake's lowest streaming weeks in years. It produced just one real hit, Jimmy Cooks featuring 21 Savage, which went number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, but it was the only song on the album that had that typical Drake sound. The album's singles, Sticky and Massive, barely made an impact on the charts. Compared to his usual chart dominance, the album came and went. Critics and fans now look at Honestly Nevermind as a polarizing moment in Drake's career. Some defend it as ahead of its time, while others view it as a total failure. What's undeniable is that it was a flop. 143 by Katy Perry. When Katy Perry announced her return in 2024 with 143, fans were hopeful that this would be the comeback era they've been waiting for. After the lukewarm reception to Smile, Katy spent years rebranding. Hype began to build, especially after cryptic online teasers and interviews, claiming 143 would mark a return to form. But despite the momentum, the album fell flat. When it was released, it debuted on number 6 on the Billboard 200, selling 48,000 units in its first week. The lead single Woman's Word was controversial and generated significant backlash for its dated lyrics and being called out of touch. Despite a flashy rollout, the song barely scratched the Billboard Hot 100, peaking only on number 63. It was the most disappointing lead single of her career. Follow-up singles like Lifetime and I'm His and He's Mine failed to chart altogether. Even Spotify numbers were low, with the highest streaming song on the album barely crossing 50 million streams. What makes 143 such a painful flop isn't just the numbers, it's the disconnect between Katy's star power and the album's impact. She was once a dominant force in pop music, a pop icon, but that magic seems to be dead and gone. Love Sucks by Avril Lavigne. Avril Lavigne's Love Sucks was hyped as a return to her pop-punk roots, a nostalgic throwback that dropped at the perfect moment, just as pop-punk was trending again, thanks to artists like Olivia Rodrigo and Machine Gun Kelly. Released in February 2022, the album had features from Travis Barker and MGK himself, but it barely made a dent commercially. The album opened at number 9 on the Billboard 200, selling only 30,000 units in its first week. More telling was its singles performance. Bite Me and Love It When You Hate Me failed to chart on the Billboard Hot 100. The songs were catchy but not sticky enough to go viral or get significant radio play. Compared to her early 2000s hits, these songs lacked that melodic punch. Even with a well-timed genre revival, Avril struggled to stand out among newer artists dominating the same aesthetic. The album's commercial failure proved that nostalgia alone isn't enough to power a successful comeback. It's a prime example of a legacy artist returning to their roots and doing everything right, but still failing to break through in a crowded, algorithm-driven market. While fans appreciated the effort, the album disappeared quickly, like most albums these days. In the Meantime by Alessia Cara. Alessia Cara's third studio album, In the Meantime, quietly dropped in September 2021 with very little buzz. Once celebrated as the anti-pop star with a powerful message, Alessia had already started to lose momentum after her sophomore album, The Pains of Growing. With In the Meantime, she leaned into the moody, introspective sound, far from what made her successful. Unfortunately, the album didn't even make it to the Billboard 200, with low sales in its opening week, a massive drop from the debut of her previous project. The lead single Sweet Dream did decent in Canada, but in the US, it didn't touch the Billboard Hot 100. While critics liked the album, it was held back by minimal promotion and a rollout that felt disjointed. Alessia's label support was not there, with no high-profile performances or interviews to generate momentum, and ultimately, the album flopped. Solar Power by Lorde. Lorde's return with Solar Power was long awaited. After her defining sophomore album Melodrama in 2017, the anticipation for her next project was sky high. But when Solar Power dropped in 2021, fans were left confused. The lead single by the same name debuted at a modest number 64 on the Billboard Hot 100, a big drop from Melodrama's lead single Green Light, which debuted at number 19. Even worse, the album didn't produce a single charting hit beyond that, and the album itself debuted at number 5 on the Billboard 200, with just 56,000 units sold, her lowest debut ever. Critics gave the album mixed reviews, calling it pleasant but underwhelming, and longtime fans were divided over the drastic change in sound. Lorde herself even acknowledged the album's polarizing reception, later admitting that she knew it would be a bit of a challenge for people. Commercially, the album struggled to maintain momentum. While Melodrama aged into a cult classic, Solar Power quickly faded from public conversation. Despite a world tour and a deluxe edition, it failed to produce any hits. It stands as a textbook example of all the hype and anticipation can be squandered when the album lacks that sound that first drew audiences in. Y2K by Ice Spice. In 2023, Ice Spice was on top of the world. She had one of the most explosive breakthroughs in recent memory, with viral tracks like Munch and In Her Mood, and massive collaborations like Boys a Liar Part 2 with Pink Panthers, and the Karma remix with Taylor Swift. Publications were calling her the new face of female rap, and the expectations for her debut album Y2K were sky high. But when it finally dropped in July of 2024, the buzz evaporated instantly. Leading up to the album, she was mixed up in controversies that soured her public perception, and Y2K debuted at number 18 on the Billboard 200, selling just 28,000 units in its first week, a shockingly low position, considering Ice Spice's massive profile and major label backing. For comparison, her earlier EP Like debuted at number 15 and had banger after banger, with only a fraction of the hype. None of Y2K's single managed to make an impact on the Billboard Hot 100. Songs like Gimme a Light and Think You're the Shit Fart were constantly mocked by the public and had a disappointing performance. Critics weren't any kinder, calling the album repetitive and lacking substance. The themes of Y2K nostalgia and early 2000s aesthetic could have worked, but Ice Spice didn't have the talent to pull it off. For an artist who had the internet in the palm of her hand just a year earlier, Y2K was a harsh wake-up call. It showed how fast the hype machine can burn out, especially these days. This Is Me Now by Jennifer Lopez. Jennifer Lopez's return with This Is Me Now was meant to be a full circle moment, a sequel to her 2002 album This Is Me Then, which featured hits like Jenny from the Block and was tied to her original romance with Ben Affleck. But despite the high concept, big budget, and even companion film, the rollout was more spectacle than substance. The album debuted at number 38 on the Billboard 200, marking her lowest charting studio album, selling just 14,000 copies in its first week. Its lead single, Can't Get Enough, barely made an impact, peaking at a modest number 24 on the Billboard Adult Pop Airplay chart, missing the Hot 100 altogether. Despite all the hype and a 20 million Amazon Prime movie, the music itself didn't generate lasting interest. What stung even more was the effort behind it. Jennifer appeared everywhere, from SNL to The Tonight Show, and even performed at the iHeartRadio Awards. Still, sales and streaming numbers were underwhelming. The album fell off the Billboard 200 after just a single week. For an artist of J-Lo's caliber, with a career spanning decades, it was not the comeback fans had hoped for. Raw by City Girls. City Girls were once seen as the frontrunners of the new movement of unapologetic female rap, but by the time their long-awaited final album Raw dropped in 2023, the hype had fizzled out. Despite big features from Usher, Lil Durk, and Kim Petras, the album debuted at number 117 on the Billboard 200, selling around 10,000 units in its first week. A big drop, even from their previous disappointing project, City on Lock, which debuted at number 29. The rollout was a mess. The lead single Good Love with Usher was released a whole year before the album and performed moderately well, but the follow-ups, Face Down and No Bars, failed to gain traction. The title itself, Raw, which was an acronym for Real Ass Whores, felt like a desperate attempt to cling on to their ratchet era. Even loyal fans criticized the projects for lacking cohesion, and Young Miami could not rap, so the pair were not seeing eye to eye, and after the album flopped, they broke up to focus on their solo careers. Which flop album of the 2020s did I miss? Tell me in the comments below.